Hello, it's Silver. This is Death or Treat. I was attracted to this immediately because I'm a big fan of Halloween and spooky season stuff in general, so seeing a sort of Halloween-themed game come out in summer, basically, is just sort of my thing, so I had to take a look at it. This is a roguelite platformer that is, well, it's super cute. You play a really adorable ghost that wants to open a candy store, and most of the materials and stuff in the game involve, like, candy and things, and the whole thing is basically a giant social media pastiche, where, like, every level is based around a sort of undead-themed social media platform like RipTalk and Facebook and stuff like that. So everything is very lighthearted, very silly, a little bit spooky here and there. It's a pretty good time. Well, I do have some frustrations with it, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. So first off, how does it actually work? Well, it's in that kind of rogue legacy structure sort of idea, where you have like levels of 2D platforming and combat, and you collect various materials and things to upgrade your town and your sort of candy store and all the related stores back in the hub area, and then you go on your next run. And one thing I like that not enough roguelites do, in my opinion, is the ability to create portals that allow you to skip some of the earlier content once you've done it enough and actually start at the more difficult levels to begin with. And there is actually a portal for each of the levels in this game that relies on getting certain, usually boss materials and some other things like that, in order to just open up portals and skip some of the worlds if you want to. Combat is pretty simple, but still pretty enjoyable. You've got the opportunity to choose one weapon and one spell whenever you go out. There are 3 different spells to choose from, so not a lot of those, unfortunately, but there are quite a few different weapons to choose from. I believe around 16 of them. And then once you choose your combination, off you go. And you've got a basic light attack combo that's different for each weapon, as well as a heavy attack that you can mix in, and an air launcher that's sort of like an uppercut attack, and some aerial smacks, and a sort of aerial slam attack that sends you straight down and does a lot of damage to everything near you. And you've got that green meter underneath your health up there in the top left, and that is your spell meter. Once this is full, you can cast your spell, and you fill this up mostly just by killing enemies. And these spells involve loosing like an army of angry ghosts as like a sort of magic missile kind of idea, or the ability to make yourself temporarily invulnerable as a sort of whirlwind of destruction that does quite a bit of damage. This one is very good. And you've got a boomerang that, well, it boomerangs. It works exactly like you would think, and it's pretty effective too for like large groups of enemies. And you will find large groups of enemies because the way the levels are laid out, they are sort of equal parts platforming and combat, with every level having various different enemy types. Some of them share the same enemy types but slightly palette swapped, but a lot of the enemies in each level are actually unique to that area. And this game does something kind of interesting that I've never really seen before. When you get to the end of a screen or one area, you have a choice between 3 different paths to go down. Usually only 1 or 2 of these paths will be present, but there are sort of 3 slots. And these paths represent going on the same elevation as you currently are, going up an elevation or going down an elevation, and the tile set of the levels actually changes depending on what path you're on. So if you're in the first area, for instance, and you go down, then everything will look like a sort of musty basement, whereas if you go up really high, you'll find like grass and trees and stuff. So this is kind of a cool idea because it gives each of the areas more tile set variety, and it means that you're not always in the same environments over and over, because each area will have around like 3 different sort of tile set environments for each one, and that's actually a lot more visual variety than you would normally get in like the early stages of a roguelite like this, so I appreciate that. I mean, overall, the visual design of the game is definitely its highest point. It is a fantastic looking game. They've put a lot of care and love into how the game looks. All of the background art and stuff, all the little incidental stuff that you'll see in each of the areas just adds a ton of atmosphere and like visual flair to everything. I particularly like the little spiders that are hanging from the ceiling that have smartphones in their hands, and they're just sort of like banging away on something, and they're smoking at the same time. They're really adorable. But yeah, there's just tons of visual variety in the game, and it's definitely kind of a feast for the eyes because there's a lot of very saturated blues and purples, and a lot of like silly pastiches of, you know, various social media platforms and things, and the whole thing just comes together to make a really nice art style that they clearly worked a lot to create. And as you're going around the levels and slaying enemies and boxes and crates and some other stuff like that, you will get these candies, these pretty blue candies that act as your main currency, and you'll need thousands of these for the various upgrades and unlocks that you can find throughout the hub area. And the game does manage to make them very satisfying to collect, right? It does a good job of having the big like tidal wave of candies explode out of enemies and then like suction up into you. It just feels really good to collect them, and I find that to be kind of an oddly important thing in 2D platformers, like how fun are the coins to collect. So having them be this sort of like physically reactive tidal wave of blue candies is pretty great. But in addition to these candies, you'll also be finding various other materials, and different enemies can drop different materials, which means different worlds have a different variety of materials that you can find, and the bosses also have their own unique materials that are kind of rare from them. And these are what you really need to do all of the unlocks and upgrades and stuff, but you only have a certain number of slots in your backpack for materials that you can bring back if you die. So if you actually succeed in a run, then you can bring back everything you've got, but if you die, you can only fit as many of the materials as you can stack in your backpack, basically, and one of the upgrades you can get are extra backpack slots to allow you to bring back more materials at once. After every boss fight, one of the characters will chill out there in between the levels and ask you if you want to go back home or if you want to continue. And if you go back home, you get to keep all of your mats and he gives you a bonus of candies. But if you select continue, then he'll give you a temporary backpack upgrade that will give you one extra slot every time you collect it for that run. Once you reach the end of several screens worth of levels, then you will of course reach the boss for that level, and there does seem to be only a single boss for each world, so you won't have like a Binding of Isaac kind of situation, you know, where different bosses can be on the same floor, but they are pretty good boss fights in my opinion, because they're quite involved. Like, they're multiple phases, usually at least like 2 or 3 phases, and they have some other kind of puzzly mechanics to them that make you do different things. Like, the first boss, for instance, will put some switches on the floor that you have to hit in a specific order, but the order is randomized. It changes every time he does it, so you gotta just trial and error it while avoiding all of his attacks. And then the second boss has a section where she floats up in the air and launches a spell at you, and you have to like Phantom Ganon it back and forth, just sort of play tennis until it breaks her shield and she goes down. So yeah, the bosses are definitely pretty involved, which I like. I was actually a little bit surprised when I got to the bosses and discovered how like complicated they were in comparison to the normal enemies. It was a pretty refreshing change to have these sort of puzzle-like boss fights with multi-phases and stuff, and they act as really good sort of keystones for that level. So what all can you upgrade in the hub? Well, you've got all sorts of buildings, but at first you have to build them before you can actually use them to upgrade, and building them usually only takes a small number of resources in comparison to the individual upgrades. But you've got stuff like Starbucks XP, which gives you various bits of ghost coffee that improve your maximum health, and there's a character that can improve your spells. Every spell has 2 different sort of paths of upgrades that it can go through that improve different aspects of it. You've also got, of course, the Smith for weapon unlocks. This is pretty important because your base weapon will not do it for very long. The enemies get drastically more health as you go along, so you're going to need much higher damage. And there are 4 different rows of weapons, basically representing the 4 major worlds, and each of those rows has 4 weapons each in it, based on the different materials that you can get from all the enemies in that region, and you can just sort of select which ones you want. There are swords that get stronger when you're on low health and have crazy ghost blades. There are magical staves that launch sort of pumpkin projectiles. There's actually a sword that launches these sort of green bits of energy, so it's a pretty powerful ranged sword, although it's quite slow to attack. You've also got a chainsaw, of course, and some other pretty interesting things like some dual blades that have a really fast attack speed but a lower attack range. So yeah, there's actually a pretty good variety when it comes to the weapons, which helps the combat feel a bit better. And that's the main structure of the game. As you go through each of the worlds, you face each of the bosses, and you slowly upgrade yourself from all of the various materials that you're able to bring back every time to get stronger and stronger and unlock new weapons and improve your spells and all that stuff. And of course there are the portals that allow you to skip worlds, but these portals generally take some materials from the next world and some sort of boss specific materials to actually unlock them, so you'd have to grind for them a little bit. So it's a pretty casual, cute roguelite that does a good job of being a sort of silly, spooky social media parody. However, I did mention some frustrations, and I do definitely have a couple. For one, the ranged enemies in this game can be a big problem because they can attack you from a long distance, like long before they're on screen, and oftentimes their projectiles have a very high arc, so they come in like directly on top of you at very high speed out of nowhere, and you had no warning at all because they started firing from so far away. It would be nice if there was like an arrow on the side of the screen that said, hey, there's an attack over here. That would be useful. A lot of games do that, you know, games in the 2D space that have some enemies that can attack from off-screen, they'll have some sort of off-screen attack indicator, and it would be nice to have something like that in this game. There's also this weird thing that happens where the enemies like to sort of float up in the air as you're attacking them, even if you're not using a launcher. Now, I would expect the enemies to float up if I'm using the uppercut launching attacks so I can set up some aerial combos and stuff. That's obviously the intention, but the fact that enemies just randomly float up in the air during your normal combo, causing the rest of your combo to miss constantly, is really weird and kind of annoying, and I wish that enemies didn't just start randomly floating when you were smacking them, even if you're not actually using an attack that's supposed to launch them. However, the game's biggest offender, my biggest frustration with it, are the hitboxes. So you have very floaty controls because you're a ghost, you float. So you have a very floaty inertia to your movement that can make the platforming feel a little bit imprecise and stuff, but it's not really a huge deal because there isn't any like super hardcore precision platforming in the game anyway, so the controls aren't that much of an issue. It's just that the hitboxes are so strange for some attacks and stuff in this game that the floaty controls can make it difficult to avoid them because of how you sort of skate around and can find it difficult to stop before you get into range of certain attacks that have these kind of wonky hitboxes. So most of it comes down to certain enemies that have a hitbox when they die. For some reason they fall over or they explode or they do something. Different enemies do it differently, but they have a hitbox that happens when they die, so you have to get away from them after you kill them. But the hitboxes for these attacks are really bad. There's, for instance, a walking gravestone that will fall forward when it dies and you don't want it to fall on you, except it sort of generates like this huge rectangular hitbox in front of it, like the instant it starts to fall, which means it can hit you before it actually even falls over, because the hitbox is active before the animation begins, so it can just immediately hit you. Also, it extends way farther than the actual model of the enemy falling, so you might think you're ahead of it, but it'll hit you anyway. And also, a lot of these hitboxes that happen when characters die are very random feeling. Sometimes you should have gotten hit by them, but it's like they didn't generate for some reason and you don't, and I can't really assume why this happens. And the opposite reason sometimes happens, where the hitbox stays for too long instead of not showing up at all, where you can go over an area where an enemy has already disappeared from and take an invisible hit from nowhere and get like sucked into the air by a hitbox that's still active for an enemy that doesn't exist anymore. So definitely these normal enemy hitboxes need to be tuned up a little bit, because some of them are just really dissonant and strange, and they extend way too far or way too high, or they happen too soon, or they last for too long. There are just various different problems with the basic enemy hitboxes, but funnily enough, the bosses don't seem to have this problem. I don't know if there was just more attention put into their hitboxes because they're meant to be more difficult, but either way, I haven't found any like major issues of that sort with the bosses. But that's really my only major sort of gripe, my biggest frustration with the game, and that's something that can actually be fixed with patches, because hitboxes are pretty easy to change when it comes to the kind of thing you can do after a game has launched, right? It's not like a big mechanical issue that requires retooling the entire game, it's just a couple of weird dissonant hitboxes. So that's my view on Death Retreat. It's a very cute, fun little time that's good for a relatively short playthrough, but has enough variety to keep it going, and its visuals are a real treat. So thank you guys very much for watching. I will put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can check it out for yourself, and I'll see you next time.